There has been a political controversy associated with the new Superman movie from about the time it was released. There is certainly a case to be made that Superman represents a set of New Deal values and a certain era in American politics when the Democratic Party was dominant and a certain kind of liberalism was dominant. When you remove that American element from the Superman mythos, you wind up with a scenario that doesn't really work, and you have a sentimental liberalism confronting the idea of superhumanity, and that just doesn't have the ability to tame that superhumanity and direct it towards the ends that actually would be beneficial for ordinary human beings. So the problem with the James Gunn Superman film is that you have We have a change of pace this week on Modern Age, where we're going to talk about the #1 film of the moment, and that's Superman, a comic book movie that is an attempt at reviving the DC Comics superhero and the entire brand of Superman and his pals in his universe. Now, this may seem to be a much more light topic for Modern Age, something that is perhaps even rather trivial, and one might wonder, is there any literary significance, is there any cultural significance, political significance to a movie such as this? In fact, there has been a political controversy associated with the new Superman movie from about the time it was released. The director of the movie, James Gunn, said in an interview with the Times of London, "Superman is the story of America, an immigrant that came from other places and populated the country, but for me it is mostly a story that says basic human kindness is a value and something we have lost." Now, there certainly is a liberal background to Superman, who has his origins, first appears in print in 1938, in the midst of the Great Depression, during the Franklin Roosevelt era, during the New Deal. There is certainly a case to be made that Superman represents a set of New Deal ideas, a set of New Deal values, and a certain era in American politics when the Democratic Party was dominant and a certain kind of liberalism was dominant. When many American conservatives heard this remark by James Gunn saying that this is a story of an immigrant, they immediately feared that the movie would be a criticism of Donald Trump's crackdown on illegal immigration that's been taking place since January. In fact, that's not really the case. The movie certainly has major flaws, but it's not really about the politics of immigration at all. In fact, in a weird way, it's more about the politics of assimilation than it is about immigration. So while the supervillain Lex Luthor does indeed call Superman an alien several times, really the movie is about the fact that Superman feels like a human being rather than a spaceman, rather than an alien of some kind. Hi, I'm Daniel McCarthy, the editor of Modern Age, a conservative review. Modern Age is a publication that appears in print every 3 months. It's been going since 1957. It's one of the classics of the conservative movement, and it's still in print today, trying to shape the conservative mind and to go deeper than the typical news magazine or the typical website, and instead look at the philosophy and the culture and the deeper ideas that have influenced the American right and that need to be rediscovered and recirculated in America today in the 21st century. Modern Age has been in print all the way since 1957, but it also now has a new website, modernAgeJournal.com, where we present some of these deeper ideas every weekday. Again, that's modernAgeJournal.com. I'm Dan McCarthy, the editor of Modern Age. The trouble is, unfortunately, that the humanity that this Superman in James Gunn's movie has is a humanity that's very sentimental and generic, as opposed to having any kind of solid grounding in real human traditions. And this, I think, brings up an interesting phenomenon with respect to Superman as a whole, even looking back to the 1930s and Superman's origins. So where does the liberal dimension of Superman come from? Where does this sense of Superman is perhaps the traditional liberal immigrant story of the 20th century originate from? Well, Superman's creators were two individuals by the name of Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. These are two Jewish kids living in Cleveland, Ohio. And there you have an interesting mix of influences. On the one hand, as Jews in 20th century America, they may feel like outsiders to a certain degree. Both of them have family roots in the Russian Empire. One of them, in fact, Shuster, was an immigrant from Canada. He goes from Canada to Cleveland. And you also have an all-American setting there in Cleveland. So you have a sense of outsiders, but also in the midst of middle America, in Ohio, in Cleveland, in a place that is as American as it gets. And that mix of influences, I think you'll find, is also reflected in the mythology of Superman himself in his story. So Superman, on the one hand, sort of recapitulates the story of Moses in a way, in that his parents, instead of putting him in a basket and putting him in a river, as happens with Moses, Superman, as a baby, is put in a rocket ship, sent away from the exploding planet Krypton, and crash lands in that rocket ship in Kansas. And it's in Kansas where Superman is brought up and has inculcated in him good middle American values and a sense of Midwestern decency. And that's what makes a Superman a champion as he grows up of truth, justice, and the American way. And that's a famous phrase associated with Superman, first in his 1940s radio serial, later on in his 1950s television show, and then once again in the 1978 blockbuster movie starring Christopher Reeve that really kicks off the modern superhero movie genre. So that's the 1978 Superman movie. And in all three of those mediums, as well as in the comics, you have Superman being identified as the champion of truth, justice, and the American way. But one of the problems with James Gunn's new 2025 Superman movie is that it really doesn't talk about the American way very much. And although Superman's parents, who come from Kansas, do feature in the new movie, they're presented in a very kind of schlocky and stereotyped way that makes them seem like characters out of, perhaps a Hallmark movie or something even cornier than that. They really don't come off as being authentic middle American characters. Instead, you can see how a liberal director like James Gunn is struggling to portray what it means to be a Midwesterner. His idea of a Midwesterner is surely influenced by someone like Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, who is, of course, Kamala Harris's running mate in the 2024 election. So there's this very fake kind of Midwestern ethos, which is combined with a 21st century liberalism in the new Superman film. Whereas in the 1930s, when Superman debuted, there was actually a much more authentic kind of a middle American ethos that was also being combined with the New Deal, that was also being combined with Siegel and Shuster's background as Jews and as descendants of relatively recent immigrants. So you had an older kind of liberalism reflected by Superman originally. And that was a liberalism that had great confidence in America and great confidence in the idea of assimilation to America. Whereas today, you have instead a liberalism which thinks of America as less than an abstraction even. It thinks of America as simply being as ordinary as every other country and as being a place where, people are just individuals, they are disconnected from one another. There's no national ethos, there's just a general sort of mushy, sentimental liberal ethos which is universal and that absolutely anyone could subscribe to. That's what modern liberalism thinks of America as being. Now, why is that a problem for a piece of entertainment like Superman? Well, it seems to me one of the more interesting aspects of Superman is that there is, in fact, a literary pedigree behind the character. So while Siegel and Shuster create Superman as a comic book character in 1938, in fact, 5 years earlier, in 1933, they created a short story, a sci-fi short story called The Reign of the Superman, which is in fact not about a hero at all. It's about a mad scientist who creates a superhuman intellect in a victim of one of his experiments. And this victim of one of his experiments goes on, because he has now a superhuman intellect and telepathic powers, to become another villainous character. And so you have this interesting phenomenon, which has parallels in novels going back to the 1870s with Edward Bulwer-Lytton's Vril, The Power of the Coming Race, and also in the 1930s with a novel by Philip Wiley called Gladiator. This question of what do you do if you have people with superhuman talents within a modern, industrialized, egalitarian, liberal society. Now, Superman, as a comic book character, is able to reconcile this idea of someone who is more than human, who has talents that are far above any other person's, with the idea of fitting into an egalitarian liberal society for two reasons. First of all, because there was this tremendous confidence in mid-century liberalism in terms of America itself as the unique place that could assimilate people in this way, even assimilating the most talented and superhuman types to the ordinary American egalitarian ethos. It does it through the alchemy of a place like Kansas. There's also, of course, the fact that Superman is a fictional character, and so he's not constrained by the realities that confront and that problematize egalitarianism in the real world. But when you take America out of the picture, when you take that Kansas setting, when you take the uniqueness of America away, and instead simply say, what happens when you have someone who might have remarkable, in fact, even superhuman talents in the case of Superman, and put that person in an egalitarian? Do you have an egalitarian setting? Do you have something that makes sense at all? Or do you, in fact, have a really remarkable tension that doesn't get resolved or doesn't even really get addressed adequately in a movie like the new Superman? Well, that's the problem with the new Superman film. Superman is very ordinary. He's one of a series of other superhuman characters in the film. In fact, he's not even the only Superman. I'll just say that as a hint that there are other characters, in fact, 3 others in the film, which also can be characterized as being variations on Superman. And then also, it is a film that has no special place for America. But it seems to me that when you remove that American element from the Superman mythos, you wind up with a scenario that doesn't really work. And you have a sentimental liberalism confronting the idea of superhumanity, and that just doesn't have the ability to tame that superhumanity and direct it towards the ends that actually would be beneficial for ordinary human beings. So the problem with the James Gunn Superman film is that you have a loss of the very thing that makes Superman interesting, that makes him human, and that is that he actually is rooted in a particular place in Kansas and in America. The danger today in real life, not in the comic books or in the movies, is that you have a number of very talented young men and women in this country who are totally disillusioned by egalitarian liberalism and who are instead embracing versions of Nietzscheanism and versions of a kind of Ubermensch or Superman mentality, who feel as if society is just not fit for them. You also have, of course, transhumanists who want to create artificial intelligences that will rule over us in something that seems almost like a mad scientist experiment out of Siegel and Shuster's original Reign of the Superman story. So all of these elements of how you reconcile egalitarianism and liberalism on the one hand with the idea of extraordinary talent on the other, this is a real problem that our society has to confront in the 21st century. It's one that we confronted both in fiction and in reality in the mid-20th century, but it's one that liberal creators today, liberal intellectuals and also liberal film directors and creators of other literary and entertainment works are not able to get a grasp upon because they simply have such a strong aversion to the idea of America as a unique place and to the idea of extraordinary talent as being difficult to fit into society that they disregard these problems and instead they produce very one-dimensional works of art or entertainment.